Hello, everybody, and welcome to Profiling Evil Live. I think you're going to really enjoy tonight. We're going to do something a little bit different, and we're going to do something that we generally, I got something playing in the background here. We're going to do something that we generally haven't done before. We're going to try it out tonight, see how it works out. It's going to be a culmination of a couple of different things. And I want to just get started by shouting out a bunch of people that are already here that have been waiting in the room. Blazer Bobcat's been here for some time. Eric Olson, great to see you. And by the way, thanks to our mods for keeping everything under control in here. And folks, you know what? I really appreciate how you all are so good at being decent with each other as we go through these things. This one's going to be kind of a tough one for some of you because we're going to be talking about a guy who was convicted of murdering 5 people, sentenced to 300 years in prison. And we're going to be talking to an incredible human being, Dr. Nicky Jackson, who leads an effort, and we're going to learn more about the effort, but it's called the Center for Justice and Post-Exoneration Assistance, and her efforts with her team to try to help people that they believe have been wrongly accused. We're going to learn more about that. But first, I want to just start off by bringing in Dr. Jackson and visiting with her for a minute, and we'll shout out to a few people as we do this. Dr. Jackson, welcome to Profiling Evil.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Oh, hey, you're going to have fun tonight. We're going to do this in a couple of different ways. We'll obviously play the pre-recorded interview that you and I did. And folks, we did that so that we can release it in a few weeks on Profiling Evil podcasts as well. But we wanted to do it in a way where you could kind of get the whole story. And then we're going to bring Dr. Jackson back at the end. And we're going to just let you ask her some questions. And you can be as blunt and frank as you'd like. Just remember, be kind. And so we got all kinds of people starting to stream in. Doc, I think what we're going to do is we're going to jump into this, but I'm going to give you 1 minute to tell everybody quickly what you've been up to. Your voice is a little different today. So what's going on?
So sorry, thanks. And I apologize in the video. My voice is very raspy. I'm just getting over bronchitis, so it's been a little difficult to talk, but I'm doing the best that I can. So hopefully everybody can understand me in the podcast. And again, thanks for having me and allowing me to be the voice for a man who's being being punished for something that he didn't do. I've been a professor for 33 years. You'll hear a little more, I guess, in the podcast about my background. I'm a criminal justice professor. I'm the executive director for the Center for Justice and Post-Exoneration Assistance at Purdue University Northwest. We actually opened March of 2022, so we're a fairly new initiative. And one of the things that we work on, just one piece, is to investigate claims of wrongful conviction. And I have to say, I didn't say this in the podcast, so your viewers right now will actually get to hear this. We have received hundreds of letters, and this is one of 3 cases where we believe that an innocent person is really sitting in prison. But this is the one case out of all the hundreds that we have spent. I've spent over 2.5 years researching, and our center, since we opened, has been reviewing, and all of my students have been working on this case as well.
Well, there you go, folks. This is going to be really interesting because I'm going to be looking for your comments as we go throughout the evening. I'm not convinced yet, but Dr. Jackson has done an incredible job of making me think this probably is worth being revisited a little bit. So we're going to go forward, and we'll get your comments as we go through, and then save up your big questions till the end when we bring Dr. Jackson on. So let's jump into the video.
Eyewitness identification is the best testimony. Did you know that the leading cause of wrongful convictions is mistaken eyewitness identification? Once a victim points to the suspect in a lineup, that seals the suspect's fate.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Profiling Evil Podcasts. I'm Mike King, and I'm joined today by Dr. Nicky Jackson. She's a professor of criminal justice at Purdue University Northwest. Dr. Jackson and I became acquainted through a mutual friend of ours, Anna Garcia, over at True Crime Daily. You know, I invited Dr. Jackson to Profiling Evil to discuss her passion for truth, her passion for social justice, and her passion for philanthropy. You know, most notably, though, I want to talk to her about the work she's been doing in helping people who have been wrongly convicted in the criminal justice system through a program that she created called the Center for Justice and Post-Exoneration Assistance. Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for joining and welcome to Profiling Evil.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, I'll tell you, I love your work, and I've done a lot of cyber snooping on you in the last couple of weeks, trying to figure out if this was a nice mix for the two of us. And I'm really thrilled to be able to spend some time with you. You know, I've taught victimology in the university setting for 25 years, and I've talked in the criminal justice system for a number of years. And any chance I can work in a role with academia, and especially PhD doctors who have spent their life trying to understand the role of criminal justice in our community. It just thrills me. Why don't you tell everybody just a little bit about Purdue, and then we're going to jump right into this case.
Well, I've been at Purdue University Northwest for 33 years. It's hard to even believe that. But I was the only criminal justice professor there for the first 31 years. I mean, that's pretty incredible. And I know, and actually I have been teaching victimology for, gosh, I don't even know how long, almost 30 years, something like that. I am a victimologist, I'm a criminologist. Most of my students will go on into law enforcement, or they'll go on into careers in law, or they're probation officers. Some will actually work in corrections, not very many. But what's interesting to note is that today, very few students want to go into law enforcement. There's this real fear about going into policing, and there's just a lot of unfortunately a lot of stigma attached to policing today. So, and I know you're really a fan of law enforcement, and I just want you to know I am too. So one of the things that we'll talk about is within this case is when things can go really bad, when police aren't doing what they're supposed to do. So I appreciate a person who has a strong, love for policing, to allow me to come in and to talk to you about a case where, police just didn't do the right thing.
Well, this is going to be an interesting exchange. And, you know, the thing that I always liked about victimology and why I spent so much time trying to learn it, I think I was probably about maybe 10 or 12 years into my career when I was introduced to the behavioral science team at the FBI. And there I was fortunate to be trained in this kind of mix of art and science of profiling under, folks like Greg Cooper and John Douglas and Art Meister and others. And I've continued that friendship. But I've always been one who kind of has looked at, let's put the voodoo on the proper shelf, and then let's put really breaking down criminal cases and looking at it from the standpoint of physical evidence, forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony, and those kinds of things, and then bring in the behavior to help you understand. But the one thing that I have found to be the most important and oftentimes overlooked part of the criminal justice investigative process is the victimology, or this study of who the victim is, and why it's so important that it helps us understand not only what motivates these offenders, but whether they're responsible. What are your thoughts along those lines?
Well, I agree. I think, in the past, we've always focused really on the criminal, the offender. And really, we don't understand how certain people become more vulnerable to victimization if we're only focused on the criminology of a crime. So for me, I think it's imperative to understand the victimology, understanding what traits somebody may possess, which makes them more vulnerable to victimization. Now, that doesn't mean somebody deserves to be a victim, but it helps us understand certain patterns, certain traits that they may possess, certain behaviors that they may engage in, which would increase their probability for victimization. I think it's important to look not only at criminology, but also victimology if we really want to understand what's happening in our world. I look at it from both approaches. I look at, offender motives. And I also look at victim and, try to understand the profile of the victim to understand better why this may have, happened so that it may prevent this from happening to somebody else.
That's really interesting to me because you think about the investigative process and this concept where you get to kind of tick apart and examine more intricately how an investigation comes about. It really, from an investigator standpoint, a case that's built on a single form of evidence is a pretty dang weak case. And oftentimes the investigators end up spending a whole bunch of time twisting everything else to kind of fit this narrative that they want. And it's really important that investigators and frankly the public and the person who might end up on a jury, prosecutors, defense, that they look at these things in totality. And I wondered what your thoughts were on that, about this selective idea of looking at evidence versus totality of evidence.
Well, you're actually echoing what I say all the time in my police trainings. I talk about the totality of the evidence. I also talk about the fact that prosecutors are, the most influential player in our criminal justice system. The police bring the case to the prosecutor, but the prosecutor is the one who is going to be, formally charging this person or indicting this person and bringing this case to trial. They have a lot of power, a lot of responsibility, and it scares me that truly at times it's one individual who gets to make this decision, makes this very powerful decision that can destroy a person's life if they've got it wrong. And that's what this case that I want to talk to you about today is all about. This case has a lot of moving parts. If I try to tell it to you in even 40 minutes, it will be difficult to do so, but I'm going to do my best. But you'll understand better when I get through this case as to why I'm so passionate about truth and justice. I always say it's so easy to arrest somebody and to convict somebody, but it is so challenging to exonerate an innocent person. And I think we've got to change that. And a lot of it is the narrative, as you've already mentioned, that's been created by police and then echoed by prosecutors. And in working on some of these cases, I'm seeing how easy it is for a jury to buy into a narrative when there's somebody standing there with power who's telling them this is what happened, even when the facts don't show us that this is what happened.
So, Dr. Jackson, this is kind of interesting. And again, I love being a devil's advocate. You say how difficult it is to exonerate an innocent person. Is it possible that guilty people have been exonerated as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always tell people that people can be wrongfully convicted one of two ways. One, that they're factually innocent and they were wrongly convicted based on factual innocence. The other is that they were wrongly convicted because of a procedural error. There was some error in the law. For example, as you know, somebody's not properly Mirandized, right? They may have committed the crime, but they weren't properly Mirandized. Therefore, the statements that may have been used against them during trial, those should have been inadmissible, and maybe they weren't, and so they're exonerated based on a procedural error, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's dig into this. I mean, you're looking into a case right now through the center of Cleveland Chris Bynum. This is a guy who was sentenced to 300 years in prison for 5 counts of murder. And the case, from what I've been able to study online, really boiled down to the testimony of a 13-year-old boy who puts Bynum at the scene of these murders. uh, by voice only. And then, more importantly, by Bynum's own confession. So, I guess my first question is what caused you to look at this case and, frankly, tackle one where there's a confession and a witness?
There's actually two confessions in this case. There's two, and and then we've got this boy who was in the home. What actually happened in this case was Mr. Bynum's sister reached out to me on Facebook. I was in People magazine, and after the story came out in People magazine about the work that I'm doing with another exoneree, people all over the country started writing to me. Inmates started asking for help. They didn't recognize I didn't help a man get out of prison who was wrongly convicted. I helped him when he actually got out of prison because I learned, and this is just going to probably be shocking to a lot of your viewers and listeners. If you come out of prison in most states, including Indiana, and you've committed a crime, we have reentry efforts for you, which is great. We need them. We have a parole officer. We have organizations that help you, find a job, find a place to live, make sure you have dental and medical. But if you come out of prison and you were wrongly convicted based on factual innocence, there's nothing for you. You're not eligible for those services. So I have interviewed countless folks who have been wrongly convicted on factual innocence who had no family left, or their family relationships were fractured. They were living on, park benches. So their victimization continued post-exoneration. So my goal really was to help people after they got out of prison because we don't have any services. Well, as I've been doing this work, I received hundreds of letters from inmates, and then I received this Facebook message from Mr. Bynum's sister asking for help. And it just turned out it was from the same police department that her brother was arrested, where my project manager had been arrested and spent 24 years in prison for murder and robberies he didn't commit. So what I did is I started doing some research. And as soon as I started doing some research on the case, I just started seeing all sorts of flags. And of course, telling people that, I'm working on a case where a guy has confessed twice, and there's a kid who says he heard Chris's name, they're probably thinking, this lady's crazy, because I would think the same thing. But the reality is, when you really look at the facts, there's no question the state of Indiana has wrongly convicted this man. And if I can just go back to the night of the murders, that would be a great start for your viewers and your listeners to understand what happened.
But first, I want to just remind people I'm talking with Dr. Nicky Jackson, a professor of criminal justice at Purdue University Northwest. Now, Dr. Jackson is the executive director at the Center for Justice and Post-Exoneration Assistance there at Purdue. And as you're looking at her, for those of you that are doing this on YouTube, or for those of you that are listening, you might recognize her from appearances she's made on TV, radio, and in print outlets, things like People magazine, True Crime Daily, or Oxygen. Now, this is a professional woman who truly is in the trenches, not just the classroom. And Nicky, I think that's really important to bring that out, that you're actually out there and doing things and not just sitting in a classroom telling people what it might be like. You're serving, or you have served, as a board of director for 2 domestic violence shelters. And if I got this right, you're serving on 2 state prison boards right now. Is that right?
I am.
It's just amazing. Well, so please, let's dig into this. Why don't you tell everybody about the case of Cleveland Chris Bynum and why this became so important to you?
Just so you know, as a professor, I do teach a wrongful conviction course, and so my students actually investigate these cases along with us. So it's really amazing that they're getting this hands-on experience. And actually, in 2021, Kim Kardashian zoomed into my class. That was pretty cool. Made national news, and she was on. She posted on Instagram a picture of us, so that was really pretty cool. And I think then people actually started realizing that, hey, this woman is really out there doing some incredible work. So anyway, I've been very fortunate with media and having students involved in the work. I don't just teach the material, I want them to understand it. I always tell them, this is what the book says, but let's talk about what it's really like. I taught for over 26 years, and before I even got involved in this work, and I always tell my students, when I taught how the system was working, but now I wish I could go back and say, well, this is how it's supposed to work, but this is how it's really working. So my students have a very different experience today than they did, 20 years ago, that's for sure. But with Mr. Bynum's case, this is a very complicated case. I'm going to do my best to just hone it in, and feel free to stop me and ask questions, because I'm going to need you to, or I'm going to just start going off on a rant. But there were 3 people who were killed in a house on February 17th, 2000. 2 sisters who were white, and an African-American male who was the boyfriend of one of the sisters. In that home, there was an 18-month-old baby on a couch, and there was a 12-year-old boy in his bedroom. And he had heard gunshots, but before he heard the gunshots, he heard 2 people speaking, and he heard somebody say, "Put shells in her," and he heard somebody else say, "Don't rush me. All right, I know what I'm doing." So this kid hears 2 voices, and he says, he calls the police, and when the police come, his aunt is deceased, and so is the aunt's boyfriend. His mother is still barely alive, and she passes away about 90 minutes later. So later that morning, about 8 hours later, he is brought into the police department, and he makes a statement, and he says he hears the name Chris. At the time, he didn't know which Chris, but he thought it was a voice he knew by the name of Chris. He never mentions the name Chris Bynum, just the name Chris. Well, earlier that morning, around 8:30, the boy comes in around 10:30 to make his statement. About 8:30 in the morning, the man who was murdered, his brother, comes into the police station. The brother, Willie Marshall, makes a statement to the police, and he later testifies that his brother calls him at 1 in the morning and says he's scared because a guy named Chris is in the house and he's waving a gun around. And so he was terrified for his life. Well, we do know that his brother was murdered around 2:30 in the morning. The boy says that a group of people were in the house earlier in the evening. He heard them argue. He heard arguing, but he heard people leave. And then later, around 2:30, he hears, he hears all this commotion and the gunshots. Okay, so now the police allegedly get a tip that it's 3 people, and one of the people that they name is a guy named Chris. That's all we know. Somehow, Mike, it goes from Chris to Chris Bynum. To this day, I don't know how they came up with the name Chris Bynum. No clue how the name Bynum gets involved. As if that's the only Chris in Gary, Indiana. It's the only Chris in the neighborhood of Gary. So police are now looking for this guy, Chris Bynum, and they pull over his car, and his car is now being driven by his fiance. And his fiance was not with Chris the night of the murder. He had gone to a VFW hall, and he'd been playing pool, and he got into an argument with one of the other persons who was named as a potential suspect. But what's interesting about this case is that when they bring her to the police station, they actually arrest her. Nobody to this day knows why they're arresting her. I've looked at the arrest report. It says obstruction of justice. What obstruction? There was no obstruction. She was driving a car. She hadn't even seen Chris, but they bring her to the police station. They lock her up for 13 hours. They hold her for 13 hours. Chris and his fiance have a 1-year-old son. And they tell her, they better find Chris, because he hasn't been apprehended yet. They better find Chris, and he better admit to what he did, or the state is going to take away their son and she's going to go to prison. So they find Chris, they bring him in, and one detective, not the whole police department, so I want to make sure I'm clear about this. One detective tells him, "You're going to say what I tell you to say, or your son's going to be taken away from you."
Now, let me ask you something, Doc. Is this on video or audio in the interview that this is said? Or is this
Absolutely not.
okay? So
Absolutely
this is
not.
something that your client is referring over and saying, "This is what I heard happened," or he's saying, "This is what
Absolutely.
happened to me."
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
And
all right.
so the Gary police did not video or audio record the interrogations, any of the conversations. Chris has told us that he asked for an attorney right away, was denied, and of course, he signed statements, and that's problematic because he did sign a waiver for an attorney. He did sign statements. So of course, when we first got this case, we were like, all right, well, come on, you signed these statements, you made these confessions, but then, Mike, we started reading the statements. That's when all the red flags came into play. We started seeing, first and foremost, his first statement to the police didn't even match the crime scene. Didn't even match. They asked him, how old was the kid on the couch? He says 5. Kid's 18 months old. He says that he tussles with Mr. Jeffers. Police reported that the first patrol officer got to the scene, and then one of the state troopers who came to the crime scene said Mr. Jeffers was seated when he was shot. He says the women are running toward him. All of these people had been shot execution style. All of them. Now, there were gunshots that I believe one of the women had been shot in the chest, so that was possible, okay? Then that's the first statement. But actually, in the first statement, he actually doesn't even say he committed the shooting. He reports that the other 2 people who were named in the tip were the shooters and that he was outside, okay? So the first statement he makes, he's not the shooter. He's just there as an observer. And he sees and he hears all of this commotion and all of these things happening, which still were inaccurate, okay? So they book him. The next day, he was arrested on February 18th. The next day, February...
So I'm sorry, Nicky, for interrupting.
That's okay.
So
I know there's a lot of moving parts.
Is he admitting that he's at the murder scene, but somebody else did it?
Yes, on the first statement.
Okay,
That's what he
all right.
says. Correct. He puts himself there, but not as the shooter in the first statement. All right. Well, there's more to this case, and so, but maybe before I get to the second statement, I should get to the more of the case. Okay. There's, like I said, Mike, there's so many moving parts, and I know this case, and I know your viewers and your listeners are trying to follow it, and I'm probably all over the place. So I'm going to try to help bring this into more focus. That night that the 3 people were killed, all right, their bodies were the police were called at 2:30 in the morning. At about 11 a.m. to 12 o'clock that same day, that morning, a dog walker spots 2 bodies in a ballpark, okay? He calls the police, and there's 2 dead women. One is fully nude, and the other is partially disrobed. There's a car next to the 2 bodies, which are hidden in these bushes, okay? Well, the detectives get there, and this one detective, same detective who's doing the interrogation of Mr. Bynum, he has a hunch that these 2 crime scenes are connected. All right. So they, the coroner's office comes out, they do a sexual assault kit, they do what they're supposed to do. Now they've got these 2 dead women, and they've got the 3 dead bodies, and they believe that these crimes are connected. So what happens is...
And why did they believe they were connected?
We don't know. at the time. There's no explanation other than it was a hunch. That's all that's written in the trial testimony. The detective thought that he just thought that these two were connected. Later, a ballistics expert did testify at trial that the weapon, or I don't know anything about ballistics, but that it looks like it came from a .38 revolver that was involved in both scenes. Okay, so I believe that's how they then later connected these two crime scenes. But there's still not confirmation. But, you know, we do know that some of the bullets, it looked like, at least matched. I do believe that I'm not sure, but I do believe that there was a connection in these two crime scenes as well.
Same gun was used in both locations, according to forensics.
According to the trial testimony, it appears that way. Yeah, they couldn't confirm it, but they couldn't, you know, exclude that it could have possibly been another .38 as well, because some of the bullets had been mangled and destroyed, so they just didn't, they couldn't confirm. But at trial, they did say that it was the same gun.
Well, hey folks, I'm pausing to share some concerns I have surrounding identity theft and fraud. I've learned a lot from our partner, Aura. They're the pros at protecting people from cyber predators. Aura provides identity theft protection, credit and fraud protection, and online and device security for you and your family. They taught me to think twice before answering those online questionnaires designed to steal our personal information. You know, it must be working because U.S. statistics show that 33% of us have been victimized by identity theft at an annual cost of more than $56 billion each year. Aura protection plans come with around-the-clock support, a money-back guarantee, and $1 million theft policy. But here's the best part. You can try Aura for free by clicking on this special Profiling Evil link in the description down below. When you do, we get a small commission. But think about it. You insure your car and you insure your house. Don't you think it's time to insure your identity? Now let's get back to today's discussion.
Anyway, what happens is they now start to, you know, investigate this as, you know, a 5-person, you know, mass murder, basically. 2 different crime scenes. So on February 18th, they get that first statement from Mr. Bynum about the house. But they don't get any, he doesn't talk about, even though the bodies have been found at the ball field, he never talks about the women in the ball field. But then what happens is on the 19th, he is in the jail and they bring in one of the other suspects who, according to Mr. Bynum, threatens him and says, you better take me out of that statement because I know where your family lives, all right? And we have learned that that individual who was named as a suspect, his aunt came to the police station, and there's speculation that the aunt's boyfriend, husband, whomever, significant other, was involved in some gang activity, some drug dealing. So all of a sudden, the other 2 suspects are released. We don't know why, how it all happened, but the only person left to be held accountable for this is Mr. Bynum, okay? The other 2 suspects are gone. We really don't know anything more about those other 2 suspects.
You don't know who they are?
Oh, I do. Yes, absolutely. They were named in the police report, and one of them was known to be a really just a known bad guy in the community. You know, we've asked, and people have said, "You stay away from him. He's a bad guy." And you know, Chris has said he's a really scary guy, and Chris was afraid for his family. In fact, one of the police officers testified at trial that Chris had actually said he was scared for his family. He had said that over and over and over. That's why we believe that his statements were coerced. When one officer is truthful and says, you know, he did say he was fearful and he was scared for his family, but nobody ever followed up with who was he scared of? Why was he scared? That should have been part of the trial testimony. And just so you understand, Mr. Bynum's attorney, we've learned, was at the on stages of dementia. In fact, at one of his appeals, the Seventh Circuit ruled that he had an incompetent attorney. So, I mean, there's just so many moving parts to this. It was not because of the two statements that Mr. Bynum gave. They felt that they were good. And if you really look at the statements, and I'm not a police officer, I'm just a college professor, I could see it. I mean, it is as obvious as can be.
But so let me ask something. I'm a little hung up on the other two suspects. The young boy says he clearly heard two people discussing loading the gun and some other things. So was there testimony that was not allowed from either of those two suspects that
they were never interviewed? They were never called in as a witness, neither of them. Isn't that interesting?
Okay.
Neither of the two suspects.
But they're just let go for who knows why.
We don't know. We don't know. They have never been interviewed since that initial arrest. Okay. So
and have you interviewed them? Absolutely
not. We'll have private investigators find them. But we have not done that at this point.
Okay.
But so Chris now is in his jail cell on February 20th. Okay. So about 50 some hours later, Detective Donald comes into the jail cell and he says, "You're coming with me," according to Chris, "and you're going to redo that statement." Okay. So Chris makes a second statement. And in the second statement, he now absolves the other two suspects. He says he lies and the other two weren't involved. He says he committed all 5 of the homicides. Okay? So Chris is taking ownership of all 5 of the homicides. Now, that sounds like, oh, it's a slam dunk deal, right? He's confessing to all 5. But when you look at his confession from the beginning to the end, nothing matches the crime scenes. Not one thing. In fact, he says that he says in his statement, in his confession, that he and the male victim in the house, he left with the male victim and they went to the ballpark to go have, I don't even know what to do, but they went with these 2 other women that were killed in the ball field. So he says, I went with Anthony Jeffers to the ball field, and that would have been after 1 a.m. or whenever they were all there, the boy says. We know that couldn't happen because the brother told the police that Anthony Jeffers called him terrified at 1. And we know the 12-year-old boy overheard Anthony Jeffers in the home at that time. So there's no way Chris could have been at the ballpark with this kid, or with this man. There's no way it could have happened that way. The other thing is he kept, he's talking about how this boy, the 12-year-old boy, I mean, this is, I think, just unbelievable. He says in his confession, the 12-year-old boy is standing next to him when these shootings take place in the house. And so they're asking him, why didn't you shoot the boy? And he says, well, I'm not a cold-blooded killer. The boy has testified, we're going to call him LB. LB has testified at trial that he never was standing next to anybody. He was hiding in his room. Hiding in his room. When you look at the statements that Mr. Bynum made, nothing, and when I say nothing, nothing matches the crime scene. Nothing. And what's interesting about if you're a victimologist, the 2 women in the ballpark, they didn't even know each other until that night. They didn't even know each other. So wrap your head around this. They go over to a mutual acquaintance home. This woman's name is Michelle. They go to her home. Let me tell you how that happens. Michelle is actually over at this woman named Sheila Renee Bartee. She's at her home earlier that morning, and she says, hey, why don't you just come to my house? Sheila's husband is in jail, and she's waiting for a phone call, and she doesn't have a phone. So Michelle says, just come to my house and you can hang out with me and you can wait when he calls, you know, you can stay over, whatever. So Sheila is like laying on the couch and waiting for her husband to call. And then about 11 o'clock that night, there's a knock on the door, and it's this woman named Liz. Liz knocks on the door and she says, Michelle, can I use your phone? And Michelle says, sure. So Liz makes a call. She makes a call. She pages somebody, all right? So about 20 minutes later, somebody calls the house back. And Liz says, let's go, Michelle, let's go to the liquor store. And Michelle says, no, I have to work in the morning. I'm not dressed to go out. I've got to be up at 8 in the morning. So Sheila, according to Michelle and her testimony, Sheila says, I'll go with her. So Sheila, unfortunately for Sheila, cost her life. She gets up, gets dressed, and she goes with Michelle to wherever. We don't know where they went. Liz had borrowed a car from a guy. We don't know anything about this guy to this day. We know nothing about this guy. But she borrows a car, and the next thing you know, these women are dead. One is fully nude. Sheila, I believe, is the one who's fully nude, and Liz is partially nude. Now, the police, again, had the medical examiner's office conduct a sexual assault kit. Mike, you're a former, I believe, investigator, and you've studied police. Don't you find it hard to believe that they don't investigate this first and foremost as a sexual assault?
Yeah.
A woman's
What was the manner of death?
shot, execution style, both of them.
Execution, not both of them just shot in the head. Is that?
Well, one victim had, I believe she had a gunshot wound to the chest, but she also had been shot. The coroner said it was execution style. She'd been shot in the head. Both of them had been shot in the head.
Well, so to answer your question, yes, you would expect that there would be a sexual assault kit completed, but there are so many other factors that have to go into play, like whether the bodies were staged in those locations, whether there are other evidence pieces, and this is again what I go back to from the very beginning of single pieces of evidence are noise until you start bringing it all together. So this is interesting, and I don't know an answer of why or if something should have happened a particular way, because again, we're looking at one small piece.
Well, I would think, and if there was a police book for dummies, that if you've got two women who are nude in a ball field, one is fully nude and the other's pants are pulled down and tops pulled up, that you would investigate it as a sexual assault. I mean,
And
I would think that
no forensic examination was done?
Oh, there was. Like I
Okay.
said earlier, the medical examiner's office, they did conduct
I thought
a
you were
sexual assault
suggesting
kit.
that they did not.
No, the medical examiner's office did do a sexual assault kit, but the Gary PD never tested it. They never ran it. They never ran that sexual assault kit. And this is important to this case because you're going to hear something in just a little bit, which is going to be like your mouth will be dropping. Like, wait, what did you just say to me? So we've got these women. We've got these 3 people dead. Chris Bynum's 2 confessions. Michelle tells the police. She calls the police because her friends haven't come back. And remember, these 2 women have never met before. According to Michelle, they didn't know each other. Michelle tells the police, she calls the police because she has to get to work. And she's like, I don't have my car keys, because she gave them to, I believe, Sheila. And she says, here, these are my house keys. You need them to get back in the house. So Sheila and Liz have the car keys because they're attached to the house keys. So Michelle calls the police and says, my friends haven't come home. And Michelle says they just, blew her off completely. But then later when they found the bodies, they realized a woman had called about 2 missing women. So the police, I believe, went to her house, and she tells them that, about the page. And this is so important. Says the phone rang, and I asked, Liz, did you just page somebody? And she said, I did. And then she left with Sheila. And so, according to Michelle, she had seen a phone number on a piece of paper with the name Chris, and she thought a pager number. So she calls that number because her friends aren't there. And no, there's no answer. There's no answer. So she tries star 69ing to see, who was on the other end. Maybe she could find that person to get a hold of the girls to tell them, you need to come home. I need my keys. But there's no answer. Now, during trial, they talk about this piece of paper with the name Chris and a phone number. Mike, that piece of paper with the name Chris and phone number, we've never seen it. It was never introduced into evidence. It's like me saying there's an alien next door, and I can't show you a picture of an alien next door, but I introduce it as factual. We have no idea. And I would think if there's a piece of paper with the name Chris and a phone number, that would be crucial evidence that would be collected. Additionally, the phone record, where's the phone bill? Where's the phone bill? You would you would try to subpoena the phone bill to see what calls were made. I do know that the officers who got to the scene did look on caller ID, and the last 2 phone numbers they found, one was an area code 219, which is in Gary, Indiana, and I believe it belonged to one of the women who was murdered, her neighbor. It was just she must have called one of her neighbors. The other, interestingly, is a 708 area code, which belongs to somebody who is on the south side of Chicago. That's the area code. Chris Bynum never had a 708 number. Chris Bynum's pager number never matched, anything. It didn't match anything. In fact, his DNA is nowhere. His fingerprints are nowhere. There's nothing. So anyway, the police still,
Could Chris Bynum have had multiple phones? A burner phone or?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And we've asked him about his phones, and we've asked his fiance at the time. She came in and met with us, and she said, you're the first people to ask me these questions in 23 years. She said he had 1 pager. She said he had a pager. He didn't even have a phone. He had a pager, I believe. Maybe he had a phone, but it didn't match. I mean, if it would have matched him, that would have been a done deal, right? That would have been, we've solved this case. We've solved it. They didn't have it. But regardless, they arrest him. He actually goes to trial, and he's convicted. Now, this is where it gets really complicated. Again, the kid hears 2 people, but Chris Bynum is the only one arrested, okay? The only one. Well, in 2014, I know, I see your brows. You're like, what is happening, Nikki? What is happening? Because this is so crazy and confusing. But in 2014, there's a guy who gets out of prison by the name of Gerald Matthews. Gerald Matthews had just been out of prison for a few weeks, and he's looking for a place to live. He finds a guy, and he asks this guy, he's a landlord, he asks him, can I live with you? Or live in your, I'm sorry, not with you, but in one of your apartments. And the guy says, I don't rent to, ex-felons. So Matthew says, can you give me a job? So the guy says, sure, I'll give you a job. All right. So Matthew starts working for his boss, and all this happens within 3.5 weeks. He goes up to his boss one day, and he hands him this big manila envelope, and he says, don't open it. But if something should happen to me, could you make sure that this envelope gets to the right people? So his boss says, sure. He thinks it's drugs, whatever, but he says, sure, I'll do it, Okay, I'll hold on to it. So I'll tell you what's in the envelope. In the envelope are written notarized statements. There's CD-ROMs, and there's a burner phone. And on the burner phone, there's a confession. And in this confession, Gerald Matthews is the only person you can see, and he looks nervous, and he's reading without question, and he confesses to all 5 murders. And this is in 2014. And he says, I believe that an innocent man is in prison for a crime I committed, yada, yada, yada. He describes in detail, the crime scene. And we've had experts review the confession. The confession is a legitimate confession. In fact, you can see him turn off the cell phone. I know the prosecutor believes that Mr. Matthews had a gun to his head. Somebody, from Bynum's camp threatened him and forced him to make that confession. If that would have been the case, I would have thought he'd have been killed right away, and he wasn't. And so what happens is, after he makes this confession and describes in detail not just how these people were shot, but he describes an injury that occurred against one of the women that nobody would have known about except for the killer. In trial, the medical examiner did describe an injury top of the skull on one of the female victims in the ball field. I believe the prosecutor thought that was from the butt of a gun, but according to Matthews, he took a club. Do you remember those clubs that were on the steering wheel? And those anti-theft devices. And he actually does this in the video, and he says he beat her in the head with it. That intention would make sense from this club. So he hands over this tape, right, or this whole envelope with all of this stuff, and no surprise, a week later, Mr. Matthews is gunned down and he's killed. And that's when the boss opens it up and finds all of this information. He sends it to the only attorney at the time that I guess the most well-respected attorney in the state of Indiana working on wrongful convictions. He sends it to her. She reads it. She sees the video, and I'm sure she's like, oh my gosh, this guy, Bynum has been telling me the truth. They've locked up an innocent man. What I haven't told you, Mike, is that Matthews has a lot of different aliases. 2 of his aliases are the name Chris. His primary alias is Chris. Okay? We do know that. All right. So that happens. And then in 2017, Mr. Bynum's appellate attorney, she gets the sexual assault kits tested. Remember those from 2000? She gets them tested, and you're not going to believe this. There are 2 hits on the 2 women's bodies. One hit, the oral cavity. There was a match. There was an identical hit. It belongs to a Gary police officer's son. Yeah. Who is serving time right now still in prison on drug charges. And nobody's ever to this day talked to him. Nobody.
And has there been question why he hasn't been charged?
Again, nobody's ever talked to him. The prosecutor's theory in reading articles and, interviews, they say that the women were prostitutes. I find that as a victimologist to be offensive because we don't know that's true. We don't know that's true. These women, we've looked, they have no arrest history for prostitution. None. 0. So you're going to just call 2 women who are found dead in a ball field prostitutes? Where did you come up with that? Where did that come from? In fact, the ex-husband of one of the women testified that they were not prostitutes. Michelle stated they're not prostitutes. And let's just say that they were prostitutes, even though there is no proof that they're prostitutes. They deserve to be treated like any other victim. And I'm not saying the prosecutor's office discounted them, because I know that they wouldn't do that. I know the prosecutor, just because they were victims. But to come up with this theory that they were prostitutes and that's why this cop's son's DNA is in the oral swab, it's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. You need to go talk to this man and find out why his DNA was found. Maybe he knows who else was at the ballpark. Maybe he knows who did
And
these
Nikki,
crimes.
how do you know that those interviews have never happened? Has your team interviewed those individuals who have said nobody's ever talked to me?
We have not interviewed the obviously the gentleman who's incarcerated. I've talked to the prosecutor, and I have personally asked the prosecutor, why has he not been interviewed? And the response was, there's no need to. In 2010, there's a second hit in the vaginal cavity of one of the victims. This is so complicated. There was a murder in 2010. Now, these women were murdered in 2000. In 2010, there was a homicide in Lake Station, Indiana, very close to Gary, Indiana. And this was a man who was killed, again, execution style. They've caught the killer. It was related to drugs. They've got this guy. He's been arrested, convicted for this killing. But what's interesting is that there was DNA left on the doorknob of the residence where that man was murdered in 2010. On that doorknob, that whatever that print was, it matched. It was an identical hit to the DNA found in the vaginal cavity of one of the victims in 2000. Again, not Mr. Bynum.
And we don't know if it's one of the two companions that were with him in his confession.
We don't know. I mean, I do believe they ran a CODIS, and I'm guessing because these men had been arrested before, that their DNA would have, been found. It would have been, there would have been a hit possible.
If they were incarcerated at a time in a place where CODIS was being collected, yeah,
Right. I don't know.
That's a jump, but that's really interesting. This
Yeah.
is all really compelling, and I feel so bad that our time is
Oh,
getting so
there's
tight.
one more
But yeah,
piece.
give me the next one, because then I got a couple of questions.
Okay. So then, Mr. Bynum's attorney in 2020, she actually finds that 12-year-old boy who's now a 30-year-old man. And he says, he's deposed in his affidavit, he says that he had no idea who Chris Bynum was. In fact, when he walked in to testify at trial, one of the officers, we don't know which one, but asked him, do you know what Mr. Bynum looks like? And he says no, and they pointed to him at the defense table. So when he made the identification, he was identifying who the police pointed out in the court right before he walked in. The other thing that is so compelling, it really hit me pretty hard, was that the police told this boy on February 17th that Chris Bynum confessed to the crimes. Chris Bynum hadn't even been arrested till February 18th. They hadn't even talked to him. There's no way he could have confessed. And during trial testimony, this detective, I just caught this the other day, this detective Donald, he testifies during trial that he was interviewing somebody, and Mr. Bynum was in another interrogation room, and he hears a knock on the door, and it's Mr. Bynum wanting to make the second confession. Are you kidding me? You're going to let a man who's there for 5 murders just walk freely and knock on your interview room door? No way, couldn't happen. Mr. Bynum was handcuffed to a chair. He could not freely walk out of an interrogation room and walk into another interview room and just knock on the door and say, hi, I want to talk to you, detective. Could not have happened. You know that, I'm sure, that people just don't walk out of interrogation rooms when, they're there for 5 murders.
Yeah, this is all really interesting, Dr. Jackson. So when you look at the totality of this, your team is convinced that this deserves a refresh and a review. And boy, who could argue with that? I guess the greatest challenge in something like this, from my perspective, is what do you do at this point? How do you move the ball forward and get this revisited? And should the state be compelled to answer some of those questions, because they may have the answer and it was never introduced into court, so it's not a public record.
Right.
That's a
So,
challenge, because I think back on criminal cases that I handled where people brought up theories based on this was missing or police didn't do that. No, if the defense was successful in getting it withheld from the trial, or then it never becomes part of a public record that people can access.
so, I mean, the other piece that's so interesting to this case, and I know we're out of time, but I'll be very quick, is that detective, he died in 2001 in a car accident, but he was sued posthumously. He had arrested a woman, got her to falsely confess to a homicide, just like Chris, and the court, in a civil case, agreed that she had been coerced by him, and she won. So she was successful in that civil litigation, that confession was coerced. And we've got other things as well. I mean, we can show a pattern. So I know when I tell you, I mean, it's hard for me to even wrap my head around it. In fact, when I do police trainings, even seasoned detectives are like, are you sure that this is how it went down? And they're questioning me, and then I'm like, yes, these are not opinions. Okay, I'm not talking to you about opinions. I'm talking to you about facts. And this could happen to anybody. And this is what's so outrageous. It happened to a man who has 3 children who needs to come home to his family. And that also means that the real killers are out there. They're out there somewhere. We're not protected. And the families of these 5 victims have never seen truth or justice. Their killers have been walking unpunished. And I imagine the families would want the right people to be held accountable. And I guarantee the family doesn't know all that we know. So to answer your question on what we're doing, I'm not a lawyer, but we do have lawyers working on this case. What we're doing, and Mr. Bynum has asked me to do, because he has no voice right now, right? He's locked up. He's asked me to be his voice and talk to you and others in media to share this nightmare, this travesty, this just miscarriage of justice, so we can bring him home. So what we'd like to do is we're going to go back, and I've already scheduled a meeting with the prosecutor. We're going to go back to the prosecutor and say, we know this case has been appealed and denied. Most people who've been factually innocent and exonerated have, I mean, the ones I know, some of them have 22 appeals. I mean, it's outrageous. So I'm going to go to the prosecutor and say, here's the facts. I'm not here to talk about the law and what's supposed to happen. The fact that he wasn't even given an attorney, that's a problem in itself, okay? But if we just use common sense, and I think sometimes we forget about common sense clearly indicates it was not Mr. Bynum. His confessions don't match. There's no DNA, there's no fingerprints, there's no motive. There's no motive. So let's bring this man home and give these victims the justice that they deserve. I think what people have a hard time wrapping their head around is that there are 5 people dead. There are 5 people dead. So the seriousness of the offense seems to, unfortunately, take precedence over the fact that Mr. Bynum was not the man who killed these 5 people.
I appreciate your passion. I appreciate the way you laid this out. I find myself, again, I love being a devil's advocate. I believe that this needs that review that you're looking for and hoping for. But things that aren't facts, it's not a fact that that Bynum had certain things said to him because it's his interpretation versus a police officer's. That doesn't make it fact. That makes it 2 interpretations. it isn't a fact that the times of day or night are different. Those again are interpretations. But what does become fact are physical evidence inside the victims at the park. It is a fact of physical evidence of a ballistic match that puts the same weapon at both scenes. It is a fact that this boy heard a voice that he remembered as a Chris, but he has no idea who that Chris is. And that's where the real devil in the details in these things just drive you crazy. But it's enough that it says, should this or does it deserve a second look? And man, I just want to thank you, Dr. Jackson, and frankly, thank the vision of creating something like the Center for Justice and Post-Exoneration Assistance. I don't know if this guy should be free or if he's a hardened criminal that should spend 300 years in prison. But what I do know is that transparency is the secret to truth, and why we sometimes don't allow transparency, including in a court system that makes it possible for transparency not to occur, is beyond me at times.
Yeah, I mean, I have to tell you, I originally, when we got this case, didn't know if he was a hardened killer. There's so much more that I didn't have time to share that are factual. And we do have information, I can't disclose it right now, about the statements and how those statements were taken and made, that it's not an interpretation. So I want to make sure people understand that while I can't disclose that right now, there is information about how this information was shared with Mr. Bynum. I didn't know if Mr. Bynum, and I told him originally, I don't know whether you did this or didn't do this. There's without question now, just no question, for our whole team and all the students who've investigated this, even the investigators who have worked on this with us. This man is an innocent man. He is truly an innocent man, and he needs to come home.
And again, I go back to my very first comment of how important it is, the transparency and a culmination of all of the evidence, not single forms of evidence. And I wish you the very best as you go forward. And frankly, I send wishes to him as he pursues this, that if he truly is an innocent man, that he is able to walk free, because I can't imagine having to spend a lifetime in prison for something that I didn't do. How can people learn more about your work, Dr. Jackson, and how can they follow you?
So they can actually just email me at cjpa@pnw.edu. Our social media is, we're struggling with that right now. We've got a little pause, but if they email or they just Google Dr. Nicky Ali Jackson, Nicky, and middle name Ali Jackson, they'll see all sorts of things, and they can find me on, I don't post a lot, but Instagram. We're going to get better. We're just so busy, and you have to understand our team is just 2 people and students. So we don't have a lot of time for social media. We've been working this case 20-hour days and doing all sorts of other things, but they can just find me. They can just Google my name and they'll find all sorts of media and ways to connect with me. There's also, they can email me directly if they want to know more. But Mike, I just want to close with this. You talked about, you teach victimology, and I'm going to end with this because as a victimologist, I want you to think about Mr. Bynum and how he was the perfect victim in this case. He became an easy target. He's a young African-American male who was out at night, the night of the murders, and he didn't have an alibi at the time of the murders. He didn't have any, he had a minor arrest record, and I think he was on probation violation for traffic violation, nothing serious. He became the perfect victim in this miscarriage of justice. So I've said there weren't just 5 victims that night, there were 6, and all the other family members who unfortunately lost somebody that night. So when you think of the victimology, I want you to think about Mr. Bynum as well, how he became such an easy target in this nightmare.
What a poignant way of bringing that full circle. I really appreciate it, Dr. Jackson. And folks, please check out Dr. Jackson's book, The Victimology of a Wrongful Conviction, Innocent Inmates and Indirect Victims. And if everything that Dr. Jackson has laid out is accurate, boy, isn't that fitting. You can find it on Amazon. And I hope that you'll put your comments down below regarding today's podcast. And please, folks, please consider sharing Profiling Evil with your friends. Now, remember, be constructive in your comments. This is a chance for us to learn together. It's not a place to fire stinging blows across somebody's bow. This is a time to really talk through this thing and talk through the challenge that inmates like this, people who have been convicted perhaps wrongfully, face when they try to get justice. And here's a question that I have for each of you. Did today's discussion leave you with enough question that you'd support a legal review for Cleveland Chris Bynum and his murder conviction? I'm going to be looking for your answers down below. And remember that you can find Profiling Evil on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And please, folks, consider subscribing. And remember, you can find us on Profiling Evil Podcasts anywhere you look up your favorite podcast platform. So thanks for supporting Profiling Evil. Thank you, Dr. Jackson. And folks, we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene. Well, I didn't want to risk losing anybody, and hope you enjoyed the way we're doing this tonight. I want to bring in Dr. Jackson here in just a second and open it up. Folks, this is a chance for you to ask Dr. Jackson questions. We'll talk about this case, and we'll spend a couple of minutes. If you don't have a lot of questions, we'll end pretty darn quickly. But let me bring in Dr. Jackson. Thank you so much again, Nicky, for taking part in this tonight, and especially knowing that you're fighting a little bit of a bronchitis problem. Folks, her voice isn't normally this deep.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And thank you all for listening for the past hour. And I'm hoping that I've at least shared some points that make you think about the fact that this man, may be wrongly convicted.
And, I really appreciate the fact that you still say maybe, because I felt in all of our discussions for the last 6 weeks almost, your passion for this case. And boy, I'll tell you, I feel compelled that there needs to be a look at this thing. I'm not convinced that he's still not guilty. And I say that because I always think about all the evidence that sits in the prosecution's hands that never made it to trial, that might answer many of the questions. And hopefully, as you pursue this, you get some of those answers, and they're forced to answer some of those questions, because you bring up some incredibly compelling questions. But here's the question that just kept eating at me as I've thought about this, and that is, I don't know that you or anyone on your team, and by the way, I want to shout out Brian, one of your investigators who's been cyber spying tonight. And but by all accounts, including confessions, and this is a piece of the confession that I think you actually believe was true, he confesses to being at the scene of this murder.
Oh, no, I don't believe that's true. In fact, I know he was not there. And the reason
interesting.
I know that is because when he describes himself at the scene, he again, I mentioned this, I believe, in the podcast, he talks about the fact that that 12-year-old boy was standing with him, and that 12-year-old boy has already said he did not actually see Mr. Bynum. He heard Mr. Bynum's voice, and he actually never even said Bynum. He just says the name Chris. So I do have a question for you, Mike. You said you're not really convinced, and I know there's, this could take hours to really explain this case in detail. And of course, I wasn't feeling 100% when I was doing the podcast yesterday, so I'm hoping it wasn't so, confusing for people. But I've been teaching criminal justice for over 33 years, actually. And one of the things that, I teach my students, and those of you who are going to law school or whatnot, that we have to find somebody guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard of proof. Guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very high standard. I want to know why wasn't there any reasonable doubt? I've laid out so much reasonable doubt, so much. What would make somebody, maybe, somebody who is listening today, what would make somebody think, other than the fact that this man said, I was there, I did it, even though we know, and there's experts who talk about false confessions, that these were actually very, standard false confessions. Nothing matches, right? Nothing matches. So outside of those two statements, what else would lead somebody to believe that this man committed 5 murders? There's no DNA. There's no fingerprints. And you're going to tell me that a 21-year-old boy is going to commit 5 murders, 5, without leaving some trace of evidence behind? It's far-fetched.
Yeah, in today's environment, especially the capability we have at a forensic level, I would agree with you that that creates a real challenge. Again, the reason why I continue to say, I still say I have question, and I'm not swinging over to the side you're on, nor am I saying that the state was absolutely right. What I'm saying is that having been a part of prosecutions throughout my career, 28 years, which is fairly limited in time, but much of that time was spent looking at homicide investigations across the state of Utah. During my time in the Attorney General's office, it was one criminal case after another in many different jurisdictions. I know that there's always a bucket load of information that never makes it out. We're seeing that right now in the Suzanne Morphew case, where we see now, because of some civil litigation that Barry's bringing against the state, that evidence that otherwise was quashed is going to come out. And I don't know what that evidence is. I don't know if it is negative or positive. But I guess what I'm saying is it takes an incredible effort to put across the conspiracy of lies, if that was the purpose of police. May have been that one police officer was twisting all the facts to meet a theory that he developed early on. Or it may be that they actually have a lot of facts that never came out. I just don't know, Nikki. And I guess that's why I keep myself in this position of saying, I don't know yet. I'm still kind of saying that.
I just think if the prosecutor had something in their file, and I did, when I was in college, I did an internship at a prosecutor's office. That was just, a few months. It's not a big deal. But I will say, if I believe that prosecutor that I interned under, if he had something that damaging, that favorable for the state, they would have used it.
Unless the defense was successful in getting rid of it. And I know that you have brought into question whether this defense attorney was good, but apparently the appellate courts have said he was good enough, and this thing hasn't made it through.
But they ruled that he was incompetent. So, we have to make sure we understand that they said, no, the Seventh Circuit ruled that he was incompetent. He was at the onset of dementia, but the court ruled that the statements, and the other evidence, I believe, were sufficient enough, but they haven't shared what that other evidence is. Again, all we have, I just think about this. Think about it. We have 2 statements from a man who don't match crime scenes, don't even match each other. They don't match what other witnesses have said. They don't match anything, right?
Yeah, you got to bring something compelling, though, that tells me why this guy would confess twice to 5 murders. And I get the idea that he was there for a long time and that he may have been worn down. And I really believe that those are things that have to be weighted really heavily. There may have been coercion that was causing him to do that. But he confesses and says, yeah, I did it. And whether he has the actual particulars, I mean, yeah, I mean, there should be
Tell that
things that
to,
he
you know,
intimately knows that others don't, and he didn't seem to know those. But again, I keep saying, I'm not ready to jump into your camp 100%
it's okay.
based on that, because I've only seen a couple of hours of your case, and I've only seen a couple of hours of their case, which would be really kind of goofy of me to say one
Of
way or
course,
another.
and we're not trying to get people to buy into a camp. We're just trying to get people to see the truth. I mean, we have people like
Or yeah,
Jeff Deskovic, who falsely confessed to a murder he didn't commit and spent 16 years in prison, 16, 17 years. Marty Tenkleff, people falsely confess to crimes. They
yeah,
falsely confess. And if people question, why did he falsely confess? We know why. He brought in his fiance, or the police picked up his fiance, locked her up for 13 hours. In fact, in the trial testimony, one of the detectives even said repeatedly, one detective, not Detective Donald, but another detective who was interviewing Mr. Bynum said, Mr. Bynum kept on stating that he was fearful. He was fearful for his family. So it wasn't like he just came up with this, sometime later. He was consistent in his claim of fear. He stated he was afraid the second he was sitting there. If you
yeah,
look at, and we'll go back to the words you use, totality, if we look at the totality of the evidence, it points one direction. I mean, of course, I've been studying this for a long time. You've only been, privy to the information for a very, very short period of time. And I think it's actually very responsible of you to say, I don't know. I think that's a very responsible answer. If somebody said to me today that, just listening to a 50-minute podcast, they're convinced, then I'd be like, wow, that was easier than I thought it would be. But I think people have to really do their due diligence. They have to do research. That's what we've done at the center. My students don't get graded based on whether they believe somebody is wrongly convicted or not. What they get graded on is how much they've investigated this case and what they found. We don't go in there saying, find this evidence. It's not like we're going in there trying to find evidence. That's not what we're, to support what we now believe. We want to know the good, the bad, and the ugly.
yeah. So let's look at a couple of questions, and I want to just
Sure.
make one other mention, because yes, I do believe it has to be a totality, not one single thing. And to say, I think to make comments that this is the truth based on one person's memory of what happened or testimony is always as risky as saying, this boy who said he heard Chris's voice is the sole testimony that should put this guy in the murder scene as well. So I think we have to really recognize that we're looking at both ends of the spectrum here and grasping at those. But here was an interesting question from Jojo Wynn, who has been a longtime supporter of us here. Has the DNA you've since uncovered on one of the women, and I want to correct, you haven't uncovered it, the medical examiner uncovered it and tested finally. Is that correct? Has it been allowed to be presented in court as proof of innocence? And thanks for fighting for him.
Wow.
And thank
Thanks,
you,
Joe.
Jojo.
Yeah, thank you, Jojo. It's a great question. It has been, I don't know how to explain this. It's not been used in the trial. I believe his attorney has brought up the fact that I know his former attorney brought up the fact that the DNA did not belong to Mr. Bynum, and there was testimony from experts that actually stated that his DNA was excluded. But that still, again, didn't seem to be enough for the court. But that's a great question. So thank you for asking that. So I hope I answered that. So yes, it was introduced and it wasn't successful. I don't know why. I think that's a great great, question one we've been asking. What more do people want? His DNA wasn't there.
And just to prove I don't always cherry pick what people that agree with me, I want to pop up Crystal's comment here. Come on, Mike. He confessed under all kinds of pressure from people that probably did it, and then the detective himself. And again, Crystal, thank you so much. But we don't know that that truly is true. We just know that that is his interpretation. We know that he was there for a long time, and we know that you supposedly have another detective who you may or may not be able to bring forward to say he was saying that he felt he was being pressured. But I want to just clarify that.
No, he testified that in trial. The detective testified. It's not me making it up or this is new. The detective actually testified that Mr. Bynum was fearful. That detective, one of the three detectives, said Mr. Bynum was afraid. And think about this. If all your, I think your viewers are really spot on and really listening to this. The minute Mr. Bynum is removed from that police department's jail and moved to the county jail, the first thing he does is get an attorney. The first thing, if you just look at behavior in itself, I think it's very telling. He wasn't given an opportunity to make a phone call. They prohibited him from making a phone call while he was in the police department. I have talked to police officers and asked them if this is the protocol of that department, if somebody's being held on a PC, and I was told it depends on the detective. One detective might allow you to make a phone call and another not allow you to make a phone call. So this isn't just, Mr. Bynum just telling us things. Listen, everything Mr. Bynum has told us, he's told us over and over and over, and he's not been really happy that we keep asking him the same questions, but we have to ask him the same questions. Then we have to figure out how to verify it or determine that it's just not, that did not happen the way it did.
There are a couple of comments in here, especially where people were victimized and then further victimized by law enforcement. And I mean, we hear stories of that often. And I think law enforcement, especially in the arena of sexual assault, has gotten better over time. 30 years ago, it was often the victim felt like they were being put on trial rather than being a victim who was questioned. So I want to acknowledge those comments that are out there, and I appreciate that. There also are some people that are really pro-cop and some who are really negative law enforcement, and thank you everybody for putting those comments in there. Again, I want to try to keep this more on a let's discuss things that we can actually discuss. One thing is here's one. Where's the actual evidence, both that was presented in court, and do you have access to that, and what you and your team have been able to put together, and will you be able to present that? And frankly, will it make a difference?
It's a great question. So the evidence is truly the DNA. The gun was never recovered. The ballistics, the expert testified that he believed that the gun came from a .38 revolver, but he also said he can't, exclude the fact that there may have been a different weapon because some of the bullets had been mangled. The evidence is the two statements and this young boy who said he heard the name Chris. I had another exoneree in the office. We were talking about the case, and he said, this case is really a tale of two Chris's. And I thought that was really interesting. I thought that's very interesting. And I'm going to also share this with your viewers, your listeners. I've been reading this case for a while. My project manager spent 24 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit. Same police department, different detectives. And he did not jump on this bandwagon and saying, yes, everybody is innocent. He reviewed this case and has reviewed it and reviewed it. And there is nobody who has a better lens than somebody who has been wrongly convicted. I don't have that lens. You don't have that lens. No attorney has that lens. Exonerees are, in my opinion, They have the best lens. They see things that we can't see. And one of the things that we have discussed is if we just look at what evidence is out there, we just can't find any. We cannot find any evidence that points to Mr. Bynum. Not one piece. If there was one piece, I wouldn't be so angry. I wouldn't be so outraged. But the fact is, this could happen to anybody. The fact that a man is sitting in prison for 300 years without a shred of evidence, and I mean a shred. And Mike, if the prosecutor had evidence, if they had that evidence, it would have been introduced in trial. They just didn't introduce
Yeah,
it.
I agree that they would have tried to, but I don't think you can take that hard line that it would have been, because that discounts the ability of the defense. We're seeing it in cases today, every single day, where there are pieces of evidence that have come out through the true crime community or through the media that never make it into the trial. So to say that just blatantly like that, I have a problem with.
Well, let me go back to this. The attorney, I'm not just stating this. The Seventh Circuit ruled that Mr. Bynum's attorney, who is now deceased, was incompetent. Okay? So if you have a competent attorney, maybe they would be able to withhold, certain evidence, but when you have an attorney who comes to trial with an empty notebook sitting at the table, that's Mr. Bynum's statement. I get that. I hear you. I hear that's what Mr. Bynum is stating. But then you have the Seventh Circuit stating that Mr. Bynum's counsel was not competent. That should be enough. I don't know what more there is. At this point in the game, we're asking people to find ways to believe that he really committed this crime. The reality is we should be looking at what facts exist. 5 people were killed. 5 people. These are children. These are, parents. They deserve truth. They deserve justice. And
So I'm
people are
I'm with you
forgetting about that.
100%, Doc. I guess the question I have is, does that mean then that the court and the appeals court is part of this conspiracy? Because they ruled that there was they may have said that, but they ruled that it was adequate enough that they didn't overturn the case, which is troubling to me.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's a conspiracy. I think it was a poor ruling. I think it's a poor ruling, but I don't think it's a conspiracy. In fact, when you were talking about the comments, people who are pro-police, those who are not, those who don't love the police, whatever. I'm not here to bash police. I'm not here to rah-rah police. I'm just here to say police should be doing their job, and that is to investigate, right? When you have 2 women whose bodies are found in a ball field, one is fully nude, the other is partially disrobed, I think it's common sense to investigate it as a sex crime. In fact, every detective I've talked to has said, yeah, that should be the first thing you do, is investigate it as a sex crime. It wasn't done. Even officers in that department today have said it should have been done. So that's my issue.
Yeah.
I have students who are police officers who are great people. I have friends who are police officers who are amazing people. I don't blame police. In fact, when I started these wrongful conviction trainings at police departments, I had a chief ask me, are you going to come in and bash my officers? And the answer was absolutely not. We're here to help educate and inform. And that's why I do these podcasts. That's why I go out and I talk to police agencies. People don't have all the information. I surely didn't. And I'm a professor in this field. And if I don't have it, and I didn't have it, and I'm still learning, right? That means we all need to continue to learning. And that's why I'm really grateful, Mike, that you gave me the opportunity to use your podcast as a platform to talk about this particular case. And I want you to think about the fact that every night this man is going to sleep for 23 years and he has no real voice. Who's he talking to? Who's he speaking to? And when I interviewed
So let me,
exonerate. Mhm.
yeah, let me rather than going down that pathway about others who have
Okay.
had similar things, I want to focus on this, and frankly, our time is running out. This is an interesting question from consistent insomniac. How was there a conviction with absolutely no physical evidence or proof of guilt? And this is an interesting thing because there are allegations, and I believe that there are probably things that might support this, that prosecutors' offices are generally an elected office. Sometimes people really puff their chests and say, "Look what I'm doing to protect the public." Um, I'm still Pollyannish enough to believe that, and based on my own personal career, I didn't work with cops like that. I didn't work with cops that made up evidence. I didn't work with cops that went in and lied. I didn't work with. I was not only chief of staff of a district attorney's office. I was chief of staff of an attorney general's office. I didn't work with prosecutors who went in and lied in court and made up stories. Now, I gotta agree that there are cases that I've heard that are so compelling. I think, holy smokes, what is wrong? And I think you made a comment that I've said many times, that the thing that a cop hates more than anything is a dirty cop. But it stops at a point where a prosecutor has to pick it up, and they either have to be part of a conspiracy or things have to be pretty compelling. And I don't want any of what I just said to be in any way minimizing what's happening and what you've done, and the emotion that I feel that when you hear things, I want to know the answers too. But I have a hard time jumping over to one side or the other. And maybe that's my safe zone.
And it's a safe zone for many. And again, I didn't come up with a conclusion until we really started researching. And I think your last comment was a great question. What is the evidence? Where is the evidence? I think we want to see the evidence. And in 2000, why not? Why not audio tape or videotape? This is 2000. We're not talking about 1970s. Why not videotape an interrogation where a man is suspected of killing 5 people? That's pretty serious. Why wouldn't you do that? Doesn't make sense to me. That doesn't make sense to me at all. And again, I don't think this is a conspiracy. I don't think the prosecutor's office, they have this conspiracy that they wanted to frame a man. What I think happened is that we want to solve this case because this is a pretty serious crime. We need to solve it. And this is pretty easy because this guy just confessed. This guy just confessed. And we have people out there who have heard other police officers state that, you know what, Mr. Bynum was coerced, was compelled to make those statements. So, I mean, again, I can't disclose a whole lot yet, but what I can share is we've done our research. I can't share every detail right now today, but what I can tell you is there was a cop out there who decided that day that Mr. Bynum was going to be paying for these 5 crimes, even knowing he didn't do it. And he actually told somebody he didn't do it from what we've learned. Unfortunately, that Mr. Donald's no longer alive, so we can't interview him, but we can look at his character and we can see, other behaviors that indicate that this was a cop that, maybe he was good in some ways, but in these particular cases, he definitely had some issues.
Well, this is going to be interesting to see what happens, and I hope that you do get that review that you're looking for, and that the prosecution is able to answer some of those questions. I think it's going to be an interesting challenge. This man, if he's innocent, certainly deserves it. Like I said in the video, I would hate to think of what happened. I'm going to switch gears a little bit here in the last couple of minutes, and I want to talk about something that really troubles me and is tied to all of this. Because again, folks, some of you are on one end of the fence, some on the other. I don't want you to be on polar fences. I want you to dig into this, get into the rabbit hole, look at it, and see what your thoughts are on it, and whether you think somebody, after they've been through appeals and other things, if something new comes up, should get another look. And we've seen cases where people have been brought out of prison after a terribly long time, leading me to my final question for you, Dr. Jackson, and then we're going to sign off. And that is, it's really tragic what happens to someone. They have no recourse to sue the state or to go after people who had legitimate beliefs that they were involved in something when they're exonerated. They basically are just kind of dumped on the street. Maybe you could explain a little bit about that and what your organization hopes to do in the form of legislation and other things to help someone who is truly wrongly convicted and returned back to society so that they can somehow, which I think is next to impossible, figure out how to put their life back together and learn how to use a cell phone or a computer or text. And for anyone who hasn't dealt with inmates, those things are a foreign language to people who have spent their lives incarcerated.
Yeah. So one of the things I've learned after having met my project manager and other exonerees is, the fact that they are living in a foreign land for sure. What bothers me the most is that they're not, eligible for the same services that somebody who committed a crime is eligible for. That's problematic. They have a lot of difficulties with not just technology, but first and foremost, where are you going to go? Where do you live? Housing, um, medical, care. They didn't have great medical care while they're incarcerated. Dental care, that's something we address quite often. So one of the things that we'd like to see is that people all over the country would be afforded some compensation for their wrongful conviction. And I hate the fact that, if you're wrongly convicted in one state, you may get, like in Texas, you might get $80,000 a year for your wrongful conviction. But if you're wrongly convicted in a state that has no compensation, you get nothing. You get nothing. So how unfair is that? I'd love to see a federal, piece out there, a federal bill that says anybody who's been wrongly convicted based on factual innocence, would be eligible to receive X number of dollars for their wrongful conviction. Right now, we don't have that. We didn't have that in Indiana until 2019, until I started screaming about it, that this is just an unfair, system. And I don't like the fact that, if you've been exonerated based on factual innocence in Indiana, you have to choose between suing or receiving state compensation. And if you take the state compensation, what you're really doing is you're saying we're not going to hold the state accountable for what's been done to us. And keep in mind, prosecutors have absolute immunity. They really do have absolute immunity. Police have, qualified immunity. So they have some protections, not to the same degree as prosecutors. But I don't think prosecutors going in this saying, hey, we want to, lock up the wrong person. But sometimes people become very tunnel visioned. And that's one of the things that I wanted to make sure I wasn't being, is tunnel vision when I was working on this case. I wanted to say, hey, I need to know good, bad, ugly. So when Mr. Bynum comes home, I want to make sure that he has, just like any other exoneree, that he has a place to turn to for assistance. And that's one of the things we want to do at our center. We want to make sure that people who come out of prison are given, opportunities for jobs. How do you explain 20 some years missing on your resume? How do you teach somebody how to use Word? I mean, I'm old and I'm learning still how to use technology. So I've been in academia for a long time. So how does somebody who's been locked up learn how to do this? So there's a lot of issues that occur. I mean, PTSD, there's so many. I could go, we have a chapter in my book really focusing on, the struggles that these exonerees experience. And one of the things I say to everybody is freedom is never free. These people are never free. I want you to think about this. Exonerees tell me that every time they go out, they stop, they look in a camera because they want somebody to know where they are. Because if something bad happens, they want
Institutionalized.
Yeah, well, they know they've experienced something you and I can't understand. So we want people to know where we are. They collect receipts. They save their receipts that are time-stamped to show where they were. Can you imagine having to live a life like that? Because I surely can't. I surely can't.
Yeah.
So the freedom, again, is never free for these individuals. And I hope your listeners, your viewers understand that. For those who have companies, if you're in a state where or wherever you are, and you want to hire somebody who has been wrongly convicted, reach out to us. We've got folks who are looking for work, and they're great workers. I hired an exoneree, best worker ever.
That's great. Dr. Jackson, thank you. And thank you for your passion. You're making a huge difference in the world. And, I've said it so many times, I'm tired of saying it, but transparency is such an important thing. And I wish there was a way to get the criminal justice system to allow more information in so that things could be challenged. And I guess there has to be a rule of law, and we'll continue to get better as a country, I hope, as we challenge things and go through these processes. Folks, make sure you look up Dr. Nicky Jackson, and please reach out to her. You've got her email. Make sure you reach out to her if you have questions. And we'll continue to follow this as progress happens. We'll invite Dr. Jackson back. And again, folks, it's all about digging into it. Don't take a polar position until you've really dug into it. And then maybe you can take that polar position. But always put yourself in the position of, if I were a jurist, what would I be questioning? What would I be believing? And what would my thought process be at this particular moment?
And that's one thing I have said to so many people. If that jury had the evidence that we have today, I don't think, in fact, I know Mr. Bynum would not have been convicted. I just even want to know what the probable cause was to arrest this man. You have to have probable cause. They didn't even have it. But I don't fault the jury, because I think the jury did what they believed based on the evidence that they were presented. But I think if they had all of the evidence that we now have, they would have had a different verdict.
Well, there you go. You got Dr. Jackson's opinion. Dig into the rabbit hole, folks, and try to figure this out. That's what this true crime genre is all about, is to really try to understand and think about the behaviors involved. And like we started off with, victimology, keep thinking about the victimology, because I think as Dr. Jackson's team moves forward, it's also going to be really interesting to see what the tie is, if there's any tie, between this individual and the victims who died at that crime scene. But Dr. Jackson, thank you so much. And to everybody out there for taking time to listen tonight, thanks. Share this with your friends, because it is an important discussion. So we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene.
Thank you.